Hello, and welcome to another episode of It's a History podcast. I am your host, Madison, and this week I am joined by Dr. Maya Kornberg to discuss her most recent release, Stuck: How Money, Media, and Violence Prevent Change in Congress. Stuck reveals how money, media, and political violence have hollowed out Congress and how reform-minded lawmakers can still make it work. Drawing on interviews in history, Kornberg shows why Congress is paralyzed and what it would take to restore democratic power. Maya L. Kornberg, Ph.D., is a senior research fellow and manager at NYU Law's Brennan Center for Justice. She is the author of Inside Congressional Committees, Function and Dysfunction in Lawmaking, and her work has been featured in The Washington Post, NPR, BBC, The New York Times, Newsweek, The Hill, Slate, and other outlets. She has taught political science at NYU, Georgetown, and Oxford, and worked at the UN and Inter-Parliamentary Union and at several democracy-focused nonprofits. Kornberg holds a BA from Stanford University, an MPA from Columbia University, and a Ph.D. in politics from Oxford University. So with that, let's get into the conversation. Welcome to another episode of It's a History podcast. I'm joined today by Dr. Maya Kornberg to talk about her most recent release, Stuck: How Money, Media, and Violence Prevent Change in Congress. Maya, do you want to introduce yourself a little and talk a little bit about the premise of the book?
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me, Madison. Great to be here with you today. As you mentioned, I just wrote a book called Stuck: How Money, Media, and Violence Prevent Change in Congress. I am a senior fellow at the Brennan Center for Justice, and I have spent my career in different ways working on how we can make democracy work better for the people that it's meant to serve.
So in your book, you do discuss three different freshman classes of Congress. Do you want to give a brief synopsis of maybe the three classes that you focus on?
Sure. So maybe first I'll zoom out and then I'll talk about the three classes. The book, the title is Stuck because it's speaking to what I think a lot of us are feeling about Congress and about democracy at large, that it feels stuck right now. And so it's an attempt to look backward in order to chart a course forward. It's a 50-year survey of change-making efforts in Congress, and it shows how these distortions of money, media, and violence have made it so much harder to make change today. And so in that kind of broader framework, I chose to anchor the book in these three classes of freshmen that come in: the class of 74, the class of 1994, and the class of 2018. These are the three largest groups of freshmen to come to the House of Representatives over the past 50 years. These are three huge wave elections. These are also three inflection points in terms of Congress's relationship with the executive branch. These three classes are all tied to impeachment proceedings in different ways, and they are all coming to Congress at a time when there's widespread frustration with government not working correctly. So to start with 74, just go one by one. The class of 74 comes in, it's over 90 new members. The backdrop is the Watergate scandal, Nixon's resignation, the increasingly unpopular war in Vietnam. What we have is a class that comes in and changes congressional procedure in different ways. They change the way in which committee assignments and leadership positions and decisions are made. And they make it easier in different ways for junior members to rise through the ranks. And in so doing, they allow for many of the members of that class to rise to chair committees and to other leadership positions quite quickly. The 70s are also a time when Congress is doing things like passing the 1973 War Powers Resolution, the Federal Election Campaign Act. They are really trying to fix stuff that is not working in American politics, including campaign finance, and they are trying to strengthen Congress's power of the purse, its war powers, at a time when the Nixon scandals and the Vietnam War are really showing how the president is usurping control. The class of 94 comes in. This is a Republican wave election, also nearly 90 new members. And they really, I think, kind of embody also this kind of change campaign mentality. They campaign with the Contract with America, which is their change document. It's an agenda for change. And they come in and they again make changes. Unlike the class of 74, many of the changes that we see in the 90s are top down. Newt Gingrich becomes the Speaker of the House, and he's an iron-handed leader, and he is at the center of a lot of these changes. It's very top down. It's not bottom up as much as we saw in the 70s. But in the 90s, we again see changes to congressional procedure. Power becomes more centralized in party leadership because of the way that the procedures change. Committees are disempowered. Newt Gingrich also kills entire congressional support agencies like the Office of Technology Assessment, which used to help Congress understand science. He guts congressional staff and other agencies like the Congressional Research Service. And really, as one journalist puts it, it's a self-lobotomy for Congress at that time. And these changes kind of remain. Congress today, we're still seeing power very centralized in the party leadership. We're still seeing a very under-resourced and understaffed Congress, I would argue, as a direct result of what happened in the 90s. The class of 2018, another wave election galvanized in large part by the election of Donald Trump in 2016. And in that midterm election, we're seeing record numbers of women and people of color and young people coming to Congress. Politico called the class younger, bluer, and more diverse than ever. And this class comes in with a change campaign mentality. So over 100 candidates in that class sign a letter to party leadership and to folks in Congress before they are even elected during their campaign, saying, we want the first bill that Congress takes up, if and when we're elected, to be a bill about reform, about reforming the process, about reforming campaign finance, about strengthening voting rights. And that is indeed what happens. H.R. 1 is a Democratic reform bill. It does not end up becoming law, but it is a big bill in the House at the time, the democratically controlled House. This class is given ownership over key parts of the bill. They're really able to drive things forward in different ways. But unlike the class of 74, at this point in the book, we're seeing members who are facing unprecedented challenges. They do not have the opportunities to rise to leadership positions and to be driving legislation that you had in the 70s because of all of these process shifts. And because, as I show in the book, at this point in history, and this continues today, I mean, this wasn't that long ago, the relentless fundraising demands, the continuous distortion of money in general in politics, the way in which violence is wearing people down and dissuading them from staying in office, and the incentive structure around kind of theatricality for social media are all things that are very different from what we saw 50 years ago.
Yeah, reading through this book and just seeing how the changes in Congress have happened over time, especially when it comes to like committees and caucuses and how freshman members are sometimes barred or the entrance tax into Congress is higher than some people might think before they get in there. Like there's a lot of information that you just don't know until you get there, like on how policy, procedure, it's like the hurdle to get going is a little bit higher than myself, and I think readers will probably know what it is. I think we should probably talk a little bit about how exactly the way that fundraising and financing has really affected Congress in the last 50 years.
Right. Yeah. So the book covers a period in American history where the landscape of money in politics just changes dramatically. I would say that it's changed just from, it's a black and white situation in terms of the differences that we see now versus when the book starts in 1974. And that's as a result of several things. First of all, in 1976, the Supreme Court's decision in Buckley v. Vallejo, where they rule that spending limits are unconstitutional, allows money to start flooding into campaigns. And so what we see, and I tell the story in the book of, for example, Henry Waxman as kind of a manifestation of this, of kind of the ripple effects of this decision. So Henry Waxman understands that money is the name of the game. He is at this point in the late 70s. He's new to Congress. He came to Congress in 1974, and he understands that if he wants to get onto a leadership position, to chair a committee now that there's a vacancy, that perhaps he can curry favor with other members by donating money to them. He represents a safe district in Beverly Hills, and so he can use this money to give it to other members. And it's called a leadership PAC, which is something that now he was the first one to do it. Now almost every member of the House does it. And it's a vehicle where members can donate money in order to build clout and power in the chamber. They donate money to each other. And he indeed does win the committee chairmanship position. And that is the beginning of what we're seeing now in so many ways, including through leadership PACs, which is that members have to pay to play. They have to pay dues to the party, sometimes of millions of dollars. in order to hope to get a leadership position, either in the party leadership or in a committee. They have to work through leadership pacts to build clout in the chamber. And what this terrain does is it disadvantages people with less access to wealth in the same way that we see in campaigns. It's those same structural barriers. So I give the example in the book of Marcia Fudge, who said to a staffer that she's worried about leveraging the working class community that she represents to pay her dues to the party. I think it's quite shocking, and people don't realize that sometimes. We hear a lot about how folks with less access to wealth have perhaps a harder time campaigning, and there's wonderful research showing how that disadvantages women and people of color and young people and other groups. But what we're seeing in the Congress right now as a result of that is also that even when these people are elected, they're now facing increased barriers to building power in the chamber. And so the pipeline to power and the distortion to the pipeline to power is really something that we have to reckon with. The other major issue with money right now is that it is just occupying all of members' time to be fundraising, to be dialing for dollars. I talked about the 1976 Buckley v. Vallejo decision. In 2010, listeners might be more familiar with the Citizens United decision that allowed unlimited outside spending in campaigns. And so now what we're seeing is just astronomical cost of campaigns, and we're seeing members have to spend all day dialing for dollars. One member told me that he spends every mealtime dialing for dollars. And that seems pretty miserable to me, that you can't eat breakfast without asking people for money. That is not the situation in which our democratically elected representatives should be.
And one of the things that you mentioned multiple times in the book is how women and minority groups often a lot of their donations are small dollar donations. Like they're not huge chunks of money. They're, $20 or less from more of a crowdsource than a handful of people. And I think that is also something that creates unbalance in who can have power in Congress.
100%. Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think that, yes, we know that the fundraising dynamics that women and people of color and other groups face are different from white male colleagues. And as you're saying, women are more likely to raise money from a large number of small donors than a few kind of mega donors. And that's why in the book I advocate for things like small donor public financing. This is a wonderful program that New York City has, New York State has, other cities and states in the country do this in different ways, where small donations are matched by public funds. And I think this is especially important given what we know about the fundraising patterns and how they differ by gender. So I argue in the book that Congress should have that. I'm not the first person to make that case. This was a push in HR 1, which I just mentioned as well. But I think that that would be a great equalizer given what we know.
I think moving on from fundraising, I'd like to look at how in 1994, that freshman class, you had mentioned that there wasn't as many Congress people going to Washington, D.C. to live there. They're doing more of like I think you said like Tuesday to Thursday, they're flying in, they're sleeping in their office, and there's not like a community in Congress anymore. It's a lot more individualized and a lot more aligned with party lines than it had been in previous generations.
Yeah. So I think the living in DC is a really important point to kind of delve into, because this is something that also Newt Gingrich and the kind of 90s class changes. In the 70s, members, as you're saying, a lot of them used to move to DC with their families, and this allowed them more opportunities to socialize, to just get to know each other. And this is not surprisingly, and I think we can all relate to this just as human beings, that if you're fraternizing with someone, if your kids go to the same school, if you're going to the same barbecues, like it's harder to hate that person. It's easier to humanize them. It's easier to build a relationship that is necessary in order to move things forward. What we see in the 90s is Newt Gingrich encouraging this huge wave of new Republican members to not live in DC, to live in the district. And I think that's huge. And that's a big reason a lot of them don't. Now, that is paired with the fact that it becomes easier and easier over this 50-year period to travel by plane back and forth. And we're seeing fundraising demands on folks. And so, they have to go back to the district to fundraise. And so what we're seeing right now is a Congress in which basically almost no members are living full-time in DC. one member, I quote, saying that there's over 100 members of Congress that sleep in their offices. Many of them now have to think about how they can maintain two residences because they do have to be in DC, although it's called the Tuesday to Thursday Club. As you said, many of them just fly in Tuesday, fly out Thursday, which is quite shocking in terms of how little you probably can get done if you're only there for 3 days. And I think we're seeing the ramifications of that in different ways. But many of them cannot afford to keep two residences. They have not received a raise in 15 years, not even an inflation raise. And I argue in the book that we should be paying members of Congress more, which is perhaps but I think that would go a long way, especially towards making sure that not only the wealthy can afford to serve, because it seems like a pretty miserable situation to be sleeping in your office 3 nights a week and spending every mealtime dialing for dollars. That's just not, I think, a reality that we want to remain in terms of the life of our public servants. So, I think that that is hugely important just in terms of how they're getting the work done, but also kind of as your question alluded to, just the partisan angle, I think is really important as well. My first book, Inside Congressional Committees, I wrote about the committee process, including kind of bipartisanship on committees. And I also spoke to members for that book. And many of them told me, it's actually at the congressional gym that I can get work done and get to know people and strike the kind of deals that I need to strike. It's at these places where you can socialize. It's at a table with food. All of these basic things that we know are true of human beings, that we need that in Congress. We need spaces for people to get to know each other. And so again, now they're not living in DC. They have to sleep in their offices, many of them when they're there, and they don't get this opportunity to get to know each other in the same way as they once did.
And, Washington, D.C., it is a city, so the cost of living is
Right.
higher. So even if where you're from is a lower cost of living area, to be able to support a second home or buying a hotel for 3 nights, that cost is just going to be more for you, especially if you do come from a lower income district and you don't come from wealth.
Yeah, 100%. I think that one of the things that people don't understand about raising congressional salaries in the context of kind of all of the complaining, I can understand the complaints, but as I said earlier, and to your point, if we're not raising congressional salaries and members have to think about at least part-time housing in an extremely expensive city like Washington, D.C., we're more likely to only be having people able to run and maintain a life, and especially those with family and other costs who have other independent sources of wealth. And so, again, in the context that we were already talking about earlier of the fundraising landscape, of the distortions in terms of building pathways to power, this is yet another barrier that we face and that we have to reckon with if we don't want what we have now, which is a Congress full of millionaires.
I think related to that is the increase in violence that Congress members have seen in the last 10 years, especially after January 6th, with some of them with security details, like having to protect their family at home. That is also something that comes at a cost of both financial and mental cost of having to think about your safety all the time.
Certainly, that's another major distortion that the book talks about. We know that there's rising incidences of violence against members of Congress, and political violence writ large is pretty alarming right now. And the book talks about three major ways in which this distorts lawmaking. First of all, it's dissuading people from staying in office. The book quotes Nancy Pelosi in the book, and she says in her memoir, when I talk to young dynamic people about running for office, and especially women, what I hear is what happened to Paul, and she's referencing Paul Pelosi, her husband, and he was violently attacked in their San Francisco home. They say to her, what happened to Paul, that's our greatest nightmare. That's one of our biggest deterrents to running. And I heard that, all too often from folks that they are retiring, or they are not thinking of running for higher office, or they are, reluctant to run it at all for Congress in terms of kind of more local and state positions because of the fear of violence and violence targeting their family. And I think that that is a really scary situation to be in for us as a democracy, especially when we think about the disparate impact of that on groups like women who are already underrepresented in halls of power. Secondly, violence is really distorting civic engagement. Members told me what happened to Gabby Giffords, who was shot in 2011 at a Congress at Your Corner event. How could that not be in the back of our minds when we do civic engagement events? And so you're seeing members limit town halls or cancel town halls. I mean, we just saw recently Representative Ilhan Omar being attacked at a town hall. So members are afraid. And that is distorting in a representative democracy in which we have to have engagement with constituents in order to represent them. And lastly, in some instances, it's even swaying the way people vote. I have a quote from Liz Cheney in the book saying, there are members who have said to her that they would have voted to impeach Donald Trump, but they are afraid for the physical safety of their families. And that really just is, I think, a gutting statement to hear, that there are members of the United States Congress who cannot vote their conscience because they're afraid for the physical safety of their family. That's just a dire situation for us to be in, and I think something we have to reckon with.
I would say probably the next 10 years of Congress will be an interesting thing to see how it evolves over time, especially where we are politically. I think there's a lot of change probably coming within the
I
next
certainly hope so.
change. I think that does need to happen, but change is hard, especially when you have 435 members that have to work together, and it is increasingly bipartisan. Like there's not a lot of agreement happening at all over party lines.
Yeah, I mean, change is hard. I think to your point, we are sitting here several months ahead of another midterm election. Maybe we'll have a wave class. I mean, the book talks about wave elections because I think that they are when Congress is most changeable, it is most malleable. So I hope that if we have that again today, like you're saying, we'll see Congress institute some of these much needed changes.
Yeah.
I might just note the kind of broader, I think, relevance of the book to what we're seeing today in terms of executive abuse of power. We see, and I think rightfully so, a lot of calls for Congress to stand up and provide a check to an executive branch at a time when there is rampant executive abuse of power, at a time when, like we saw in the 70s in some ways, we're seeing a president who is usurping war powers, even though the Constitution gives Congress the right to declare war. We're seeing a president who is trying to take power of the purse away from Congress and claiming impoundment authority in a similar way to what Nixon did. And so I think that the lesson that we can draw from the book and just in general from the class of 74 is that Congress needs to resource and retool itself in order to stand up to the executive. We have to have a Congress that can stand up if we want to save our democracy. And so what we saw in the 70s is Congress passing the Impoundment Control Act, as I said, the war powers resolutions. These are things that are up right now for debate in Congress, and members are pushing to kind of strengthen them and use them again, and that's important. And in the 70s, congressional process changed. They reorganized things like committees, and they kind of retooled themselves in order to be strong enough to stand up to the executive. And I think that that is really critical when we think about what we would hope that a new class of freshmen will do. We have to reorganize committees if the last time we organized committees in the House was the 70s, if we're going to want to get anywhere. We have to kind of reverse the lobotomy that Congress did in the 90s and give it the tools and the resources that it needs in order to be able to conduct oversight. And so I think that that is critical. And that is a point that I make in the book that I really want to emphasize here, because I think that it is unfortunately increasingly relevant in terms of the kind of slide towards authoritarianism or the danger of that we're facing now.
Yes, we are definitely in a change period, I believe. I think this upcoming election is really going to lay out how the next few years are going to go. Well, I just want to mention before we leave that I did really enjoy reading this book. I found it very approachable for readers. If you are newer to academic reading, I would definitely go for this book. It is eye-opening, and I think it really explains some parts of how our government works that might not be known to your average regular person out on the streets. So I appreciate this book for how it opens up something new for readers and for Americans to know about their government.
Well, thank you for being in conversation with me today. And that was certainly the intention of the book, is to make Congress more approachable because I think that that's what we have to be working towards. So I'm glad to hear that. And I hope that the book will inspire people to be more engaged with Congress and to feel more of a stake in how it functions and how we can make it work better.
Thank you for coming on today. Is there anywhere that people can find you, like online?
Yeah, my website is mayakornberg.com. And if folks are interested in the book, it's available wherever books are for sale.
Awesome. I will definitely have a link to the book in the description. And just want to say thank you again to Dr. Maya Kornberg for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Madison. It's great to be here today.
Thank you again to Dr. Maya Kornberg for coming onto the show. I will make sure to link the book below. Thank you for listening to this week's episode. If you liked what you heard, head over to Spotify or Apple Podcasts and leave a review. If you have any questions, comments, or topic ideas, you can email me at it'sahistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can also find me over on Instagram and Threads at It's a History Podcast. Thank you again for listening to this week's episode, and I hope to have you in the next one.